Welcome. We're going to go ahead and get started. So welcome to our program called Selling EMEA, the practical issues when engaging sales professionals abroad. We're going to be testing out again today a brave new format, which I'll describe in a moment. My name is Mike Droke. I'm a senior partner in the Labor and Employment Practice Group at Dorsey and Whitney. For those unfamiliar with Dorsey, we're a global law firm with 19 offices around the world, including Washington State, where I reside, California, where I also practice, Minneapolis, New York, through Canada, London, Shanghai, Hong Kong, truly around the world. I myself am a former human resource management professional, was also an operations manager. I've been a practice group head, an office head here in Seattle. So I've hired lawyers, and I've been one for about 24 years. And I've been to a lot of CLE programs, seen a lot of webinars. What we found is that most of the legal presentations are really done in a talking heads format. You see the two heads that will be talking at you today on the screen. And that, frankly, they're usually pretty boring and not all that interesting and very much not interactive. So we're going to have some talking heads too today, but want to have more of a conversation or an interactive dialogue, if you will, about an issue. Here we picked the one of selling EMEA, or engaging salespeople in the European theater, as it were. And by doing that, we're trying to walk the talk and provide the same kind of practical advice that we give clients every day in a web-based format. So let's see how it goes. We really welcome your feedback. You'll be getting a survey form at the end of the presentation. I strongly encourage you to fill it out, both substantively and also if you like the format, please let us know, or if there's any other feedback, we'd like to hear that as well. For example, in the last presentation we gave, we had some feedback that certain topics really led themselves to more of a lecture style format, and so you'll hear some of that today as we kind of work out the kinks of our system here. One more thing is that we've activated a window for you to ask questions. For example, one person's already asked about audio versus via the internet. If you have specific questions, please identify them there, and we'll get to them as best we can. If you'd like us not to mention your name, then just put anonymous in the question. So, Carla, just as we get going, I've had a couple of people say that they're not getting sound easily off the internet version. We do have this recorded, but if you wouldn't mind checking that would be great. So for those who, I'm going to just go back one slide. You can listen to the audio portion by dialing the 800 number that's identified here, 1-800-536-9136, with the access code of 903-8709#. So that's the easiest way to dial in. Now introducing my colleague Juliet Carp. Juliet has been practicing employment law for companies for over 20 years. She practices in the full range of employment and labor law questions. She's resident in our London office, as you'll tell immediately when she starts speaking, and also advises companies as they look at other regions that they're considering. So Juliet, starting with why choose this topic, I want to get your take on why would selling in EMEA be something that's important to different kinds of companies?
Well, hello everybody. Well, people usually want to sell in EMEA because they want to sell their products. So it's a big market. But why the topic is interesting is, I suppose, because hiring people in Europe, Middle East, and Africa is not as simple as it sounds. And I think that's what we're going to talk about today.
So from my perspective, it's often the first time that people really think about going international. They'll have a U.S.-based company. They start selling well here in the United States. And interestingly, even though I'm based really on the Pacific Rim and have for my whole career, a lot of times the first place that people start as a foray into the international market happens in Europe somewhere or another.
It may be because often people start in the UK, and I think the reason for that is simply that we speak English, and it seems easier.
So as we talk about moving into the international market, we've got 5 different issues that we wanted to identify for people. We're going to take each of these in order. First is to look at the business needs of the company, essentially what's driving this particular decision. Next, the tax implications of various ways that something could be structured. Employment law and immigration issues are obviously important. That's what Juliet and I practice primarily. And then also the business-related regulations that can apply in various jurisdictions, and I would say in particular in looking at what happens when termination of the engagement would occur. So we started off with business needs first, and that sounds kind of obvious, Juliet, but why do you list that as the first issue?
I think it probably is kind of obvious, or at least it's obvious if you're in the business. The bit that isn't so obvious, I think, is that advisors need to be told, and I think advisors are particularly bad about asking for the detail. So not just, I want to hire a salesman, he needs to be in Germany, but a question like, why Germany? When does he need to be there? What is he going to be selling? Does it have to be a German doing the selling in German? Is it a sophisticated product that you maybe need someone from America to go and sell? So all those sorts of things. The advisors just need to know.
Who's usually driving the decision?
Well, the decision to send someone is going to come from the business side. So usually it'll be very sales motivated. Someone will think they're going to make money or whatever by putting somebody into a particular location. The idea is unlikely to be generated by HR. Typically, the advisors are going to be instructed by people who didn't initiate the decision.
With respect to any sales professionals on the conference call, I find that often, from my perspective, it's really driven by a sales opportunity, and there's a lot of focus on the opportunity side and not so much focus on the cost side. So the return but not the investment, that kind of thing. Is that what you see too, Juliet?
Well, there's often a pressure to get things done quick when people have an idea, but I think there are a couple of things that are maybe underestimated. The first is what the real costs are, because if you've never done it before, of course, you don't know what the real costs are, and it can be really expensive. And I think sometimes there are unrealistic expectations about how quickly things can be done. So yes, there usually is a lot of pressure to get on and do it. I think it's less so the second time people move into a new country, but if it's new ground, then yes, there'll be push.
And who do you recommend be part of the kind of decisional team at the company?
Well, I think if you're trying to get something done, it makes sense for one person to be in charge. That person could be an operations person, an HR person, or in-house counsel. But they'll obviously need to liaise with internal people who have relevant skills. And I guess different businesses are structured different ways. If there's an in-house legal person, they'll want to be involved. HR will want to be involved if there is an HR team. If there's a specialist tax advisor internally, they'll want to be involved. I think it depends what the business has got. The only thing I would say is that if they're thinking of sending salesmen abroad, it's probably quite a big business already. So there will be a few people who are interested.
Now, looking at the list of participants here, I can tell most folks are either come out of one of 3 different camps, either the legal side, the human resources side, or the tax side. And
yeah.
Can you just identify briefly what the questions are that each of those 3 should be asking on the business need?
Well, I guess when you're internal, the business need is probably obvious. I think the bigger issue is about communicating that business need outside the business. So, I think tax, HR, operations, sales, they all have an interest in the same facts. It's just they play in different ways. So, for example, the length of time that you want the person to be doing the job for may have quite significant tax implications. But the length of time that you want someone to do the job for will also have HR implications. So I think they're interested in the same facts.
Now, you mentioned tax several times. What are the tax issues that people come across?
You've made me nervous now because I know there are tax people on the line. So I should put this in my simple sort of employment lawyer's take, which is basically that the corporation tax tends to be more important than the other things because there tend to be bigger figures involved. And the thing that we're usually concerned about is when a business goes into a new country, whether we create something called a permanent establishment. The concern is really that if you work across borders, instead of having one country's tax authorities interested in collecting tax, you're likely to have competing tax authorities interested in collecting tax. And the worst thing for the business would be to have profits taxed in a more expensive place. I'm putting this very simplistically, and I'm sure that the tax people will fire their questions in. But I think from the point of view of the HR or employment person trying to organize the recruitment, the big thing is to check in with the tax people first, because corporation tax is generally more important than the hire of one single salesman. It doesn't mean that, or usually doesn't mean that you can't hire the salesman. It just means you need to think about, for example, whether you need to set up a subsidiary or perhaps whether you need to describe the individual's duties very carefully in the contract. So there are things that you can do to make it right, but it's important to check with the tax people.
So just to explain that for the non-tax folks that are online, how does this work? I mean, if I'm a U.S. company and I'm selling my products here in the U.S. and all I'm really doing in the foreign jurisdiction is soliciting contracts, would that be something that is even an issue?
Sometimes it isn't. I mean, usually when the first person starts selling, I'll use the UK as an example because I'm more familiar with the UK. Let's suppose the first person comes to sell in the UK. You'll have a decision to make about whether you hire a contractor or an employee. Let's say you hire an employee. Usually you make a decision. Firstly, do you want a subsidiary? And if it's just going to be one individual selling for a while, you probably won't bother with that. And then the second decision is if you're going to hire that employee, what will their duties be? And it may be that you scope the duties in a way where they don't have authority to conclude contracts here. They just make introductions. And you scope the contract in a particular way, and you avoid the permanent establishment issue at least for a while, and then usually it's readdressed a little bit later as the business grows. So it's not a static thing that you just address at the outset. It's something that people need to keep an eye on as the business grows.
Now, what are the kind of tripwires that if I'm a HR person, say for example, and I'm ask some questions about the next person that we hire or what addresses to list on business cards and the like. What are the things that where you start to really say, I need to raise my hand and ask the question again about whether we're creating a permanent establishment for tax perspective?
I think you're going off my territory a little bit, Mike. I'm a humble employment lawyer, but usually I would ask more questions if the person was doing more than making introductions. So as soon as they're working here, then I would start worrying.
And what do you mean by working there?
I mean actually producing a product, making something, making sales here, doing something substantial. If it's just introductions or making people aware of a product, I'd be less worried. But that's really a tax question, Mike. I'm sure someone will dial in and give us a beautiful answer. But I think the key thing for HR people is just to know that it's an issue and to make sure it gets to the right place so that decisions can be made.
So, for example, if you started seeing contracts for approval or requests to hire additional salespeople and the like, those are the kinds of situations where you'd say, okay, we need to look at it again.
Well, normally what I would do with the first salesman is I would put an express clause in his contract saying he's not allowed to hire people. I would say he's not allowed to hire people, he's not allowed to talk to the press, he's not allowed to, take on premises, a whole string of things he's not allowed to do. One of the difficulties you have sometimes with salespeople is that writing it into the contract is not enough. So I think it's just something you have to monitor. And because the consequences of getting it wrong are quite severe, I think it's not something that you monitor once a year. Somebody senior in the Home Office needs to keep an eye on it.
Now, the next issue identify as payroll taxes or other withholdings. How does that work?
Well, payroll and withholdings work in the same way pretty much the world over, and that is that if you employ someone, quite often you have an obligation to withhold tax and pay it over to the tax authorities. There are some interesting things here. The first is that when you send the first person into a new jurisdiction, sometimes there isn't a withholding obligation. So sometimes people get very worried about having to set up a payroll and the obligation isn't there. So I think the first thing is to check with the tax advisors that there actually is a payroll obligation. The second step, if there is one, is usually to hire some outsourced administration service to deal with the withholding on the company's behalf. So that's not something that people would normally do in-house because withholding is a very local thing. That's just something you have to do. And of course,
why would they outsource it? That sounds kind of expensive.
Well, it is expensive. I mean, the reality is when you send somebody to work in a new jurisdiction, you have to do all the things you would in your home jurisdiction. Difference is instead of doing it for 1,000 or 2,000 people, you're doing it for one. And so it becomes disproportionately expensive to administer an employment for one person. I mean, that is just the reality of hiring someone to work abroad. Usually, if you've only got one person and you have a payroll obligation, it's cheaper to outsource, and that's why people do it.
And is it outsourced through a payroll company where they cover the entire payroll, or do they just cut the check?
It depends. I mean, we're talking about different locations with different regimes. Normally what would happen is that you would just pay someone a monthly fee for administering the payroll. Social Security, I think, is probably the more interesting thing to focus on because that's different. In Europe, for example, Social Security contributions are very high in some jurisdictions, and they vary enormously. So, for example, the UK is considered to be relatively cheap. A lot of people would think that a country like France is very expensive, and it's something that needs to be factored into the cost. These are real costs. So employers' Social Security contributions, be a very high percentage of salary in some places.
So can you give an example of the ranges that you're talking about? Are we, 10, 15, 20%, or higher than that?
No, it could be much higher than that. Much higher than that.
Is that per jurisdiction that they work in? So, for example, if you've got a traveling salesperson, do you have to worry about where they're traveling to?
Not really. Tax and Social Security are administered in very different ways, which can be quite confusing. So in Europe, there's a consistent regime for Social Security. So if you hire someone in Europe, they will probably be attached to one Social Security jurisdiction. So if you hire a Brit in the UK, it'll be the UK Social Security contributions that need to be paid. If you hire a German in Germany, you'll have to pay German Social Security contributions at German rates. When it gets complicated is if you send somebody from one country to work in another, but they would only be in one country's Social Security regime. The interesting question is then which applies, and normally it's their home country. So I'll give you an example. If you send an American over to Italy, most likely you can keep them in the American Social Security scheme for a while.
And what if that person was from within the EU, say a British citizen?
Yeah, similarly, if you move someone from one place to another, they can usually stay in their home scheme for a while. But you need to be very careful because there are rules about when and how you can do that. And it is something that's worth getting specific specialist advice on because there's a lot of money involved, particularly if the assignment goes on for a while. It's less of a worry if you've got a local hire who's just traveling through Europe because they'll just stay in their home scheme.
Now, here in the U.S., we often talk about kind of rules of thumb. For example, that a lot of companies want to look at contractors every 12 months, or they feel like if the person is only spending a few months here or there working in a different country, they don't have anything to worry about. That's not always true, but it's definitely one of the things we hear a lot. What are the rules in Europe if you have somebody who's moving around?
Let's suppose you've got someone who's working in France, Germany, and Belgium. So they're sort of moving between the three. As a rule of thumb, they will be in one country's Social Security scheme, and it'll be where they live. So you've got a Frenchman who does a bit of work in Germany, he does a bit of work in Belgium, he'll stay in his French social security scheme. That part is relatively straightforward. The bit that's complicated if you've got mobile salesmen is tax, because if they spend time working in any of those countries, they could trigger local tax obligations. So tax could be due in all three countries.
The same is actually true here in the U.S. If you have somebody working partly in Washington, partly in Oregon, they'd be required to pay Oregon state income tax, but a lot of folks don't know that. So it comes as a surprise in both directions, really. Now, you've identified impact of mobility. What does that mean?
I was really trying to just identify just that. If you're hiring a salesman to work in one place, it's a lot simpler than if they're traveling. If they're traveling, you need to think of more than one country's rules. So I'll give you one example would be the tax authority's interest in the tax in all three places. I think it's just a question of thinking about it and making sure the paperwork's right. And in most, you're probably aware that most countries have arrangements whereby the same income is being taxed by two different places. It can be offset. So it's not as bad as it sounds, but you need to make sure that you follow the rules and get the admin right.
We call those tax equalization treaties. What are they called there?
In England, we call them double tax treaties, but actually, strangely, it isn't really a double tax treaty in most of the places we're talking about. But yeah, it's different jargon for the same things. Most of the concepts you have for moving people around the US will work equally well in Europe. The big thing about Europe, I suppose, is just that we have a lot of very small countries that are very close together, so crossing borders is very easy. For me to go to Belgium for the day is not difficult, and it's a completely different place.
Since we're talking about mobility, that leads obviously straight into the question of immigration and how people physically can move borders. Obviously, within the EU, it's very easy and less so if you're talking about other jurisdictions. But the first thing that we kind of look at is the person, and often I get this question, is this a local hire or is this somebody who's an expat? What is the difference there?
What people are usually talking about is where you're recruiting people. So a local hire would be, for example, you want someone to work in Switzerland, you find a Swiss person in Switzerland, and they are hired to work in Switzerland. So one jurisdiction. Expat is probably a bit broader. People mean different things. So, for example, London is full of expats. Some of them, if I was recruiting, I would consider to be local hires because they've been here a long time. They'd be hired in exactly the same way as anybody else. I think the more interesting questions are, does the person need immigration clearance? And do they require some sort of assignment package because you're going to move their home physically from one place to another? And of course, we have lots of variations on the theme in Europe. We have lots of people who work, live in one country and work in another. I think the jargon doesn't matter so much as drilling down to what the person is actually doing.
So can you talk about the timing of getting immigration clearance? It sounds like really that's an issue only if you're hiring someone who's an expatriate. But how does the immigration part work?
Theoretically, immigration is something that people are quite aware of. The truth is that different kinds of clearance take different lengths of time. The simple one is if you hire a European who's going to work in Europe, they don't need immigration clearance. So they've got a passport, they're entitled to live and work within the EU. But there are lots of nuances on that. There still may be paperwork to fill in. There are some EU countries where there are still restrictions, so you still need to get advice. You could have an American coming to work in the EU, and you could find that they actually are entitled to a European passport because of their ancestry. You've got an expat, you could think, I've got an expat Portuguese person, no problem sending them to France. But you could find the wife is actually from China, and it could be an issue. So I think you have to treat each case individually, and you need to look at each jurisdiction individually, and within the jurisdiction there will be different immigration rules for different categories. So I'll give you an example. In the UK, you might be transferred to another group company in the UK for an intercompany transfer. It's a concept you're quite familiar with the US. Or you might, for example, come over here as your company's sole rep. So that might be someone in the salesman category, the first person to come here to sell things. And they would get different kinds of immigration clearance. So I think the key thing to remember is that immigration clearance often can't be hurried up. So you need to check to see what the requirements are. And as I said before, you need to understand what the business needs are in order to make appropriate compromises. You also need to be a little bit aware of, actually, it's primarily US audience, so you'll be quite conscious of that, but there's an interaction with race discrimination. So I'll give you an example. You could have a local hire in the UK. You might assume that it's a local hire, and then when you hire them, you realize they need immigration clearance because they had it at their previous employer. So don't assume because you hire people locally that they're able to work for another business locally. Everybody needs to be checked.
So that's something that we are quite familiar with, just making sure that you have the right to work and that that's a precondition of hire.
You can't. I'm going to stop you there, Mike, because you can't make it a precondition of hire here. You need to be very careful to do the recruitment first and then consider the immigration issues afterwards because of the potential for race discrimination. So that's one of those sort of red flag things where you just do need to tread the tightrope a little bit.
So the offer letter, in other words, you'd want to look at to make sure that the timing was right.
Yeah, I mean, oftentimes it's pretty obvious, but it's certainly the case you should not be filtering people by their immigration status. So and that's the same across.
Using an example that I often have, you've got somebody who's a U.S.-based employee who's volunteering to take on the role in the UK, for example. How long does the immigration clearance process take in that type of situation? We have the expression here, how long is a piece of string? It depends what sort of process it is. It might be just a few weeks. It could be much longer. And you've contrasted speeding up the immigration process as compared to other kinds of things that you could speed up. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, for example, if you were to ask me to draft a contract, and if you're going to hire someone over here, you're going to need a contract. I might need a few days to do a good job, but that doesn't mean I can't do it overnight if it really had to be done. And similarly, although it is good to have a contract in place before someone starts work, if they start work without it, it probably isn't going to kill you. So employment is probably one of the more flexible areas. The same with tax. I mean, if you don't do your tax planning before you hire someone, you run the risk of losing money, but it's not going to stop you hiring them. Whereas with immigration, if they don't have clearance and you hire them, it is a real problem. So I think that's something you just have to check.
You've identified employer independent contractor. Can you first just describe what is an independent contractor?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you have the same concepts in the US. It's one of those things. It seems technically very complicated, but actually, if you talk to advisors around the world, we always agree. A contractor is someone who works for themselves. So a self-employed person who works for themselves, pays their own taxes, doesn't receive benefits, chooses their own hours of work, travels Europe or the Middle East selling things. An employee is what you would think of as an employee in the US, somebody who reports to someone who maybe has staff, who's part of a bigger organization, gets paid a salary, has taxes deducted at source. You get the flavor.
What are the implications of being a contractor from an immigration perspective?
Generally different immigration clearance. So you might have different categories for employees from contractors. One is not necessarily better than the other. It's just that the rules may be different.
Now, one term I hear a lot is called the managing director. What is a managing director?
It's a good question because quite often they're neither managing nor directing anymore. We used to use that term in England to mean the most senior person in the company. But these days you can have lots of MDs. I mean, it's not a term of art at all. It is better to save managing director for someone who's genuinely a director, so there's no confusion. But as I say, it's not a term of art.
And then you've identified mobility implications here as well as you did on the tax side. Why do you raise that here?
Simply that if people are moving across borders, the rules may be different. Europe in some ways is relatively straightforward because you can get clearance to work across borders, or you could have a passport that allows you to do that. But if, for example, you had someone working in the Middle East, most likely the immigration clearance is only going to cover one particular country, and if they work in another country, you're going to have to get separate clearance. So you need to be aware of that. Generally, I think immigration is a bit easier to manage from a mobility perspective than tax. The tax, there's admin for everyone. The immigration, there isn't.
You know, it's interesting. You've split the idea of EMEA into really two things. First, E, and then second, MEA. You know, namely Europe, and then the Middle East and Africa. And I noticed you did that on employment as well. Why, when you look at things from an employment perspective, why would you look at Europe differently and more homogeneously, I guess, than you would the Middle East and Africa?
Maybe the easiest way to look at this one is just to sort of run through some of the things that I found a bit surprising about Europe when I first started doing cross-border work. And when I say Europe, the English are a bit schizophrenic on this. Obviously, we are part of Europe, but sometimes when we talk about Europe, we mean continental Europe. The starting point is a sort of US versus Europe thing. Often people are surprised that there's no at-will employment here and that you have to have a contract. In every European country, you will have to have a contract, and at-will employment will not be possible. The thing that's unusual, I suppose, is to try and think of it as the US as being out of step with the rest of the world. I don't know another country where at-will employment is possible, only the US. The bit about contracts is important to understand as well, because contracts here generally are there to protect the employer. You have the contract anyway. If you don't write anything down, all that will be in dispute is what the terms are. So, you know, you can guess if you go to a tribunal or a court, probably if there's a dispute, it will be decided in the employee's favor if there's some sort of ambiguity. So it's good to write things down. But without a contract, you also can't do a lot of other things which are quite useful. For example, imposing non-competes, or what we call restricted covenants, trying to give the employer discretion over some things. Good to have a document. So first of all, documents are important. There's a little bit of nuance there in that the UK is a bit different from the rest of Europe. We tend to write a lot of things down, so we have long contracts. In some European countries, the contracts are very short, and I think the mistake is probably to think very short is easier. Often the contract documents are very short in other countries because most of the difficult terms are in laws or collective agreements that apply to everybody willy-nilly. So you see a bit further down the list, I've mentioned mandatory collective agreements, which is a little bit scary the first time you come across it. The idea is basically you have collective bargaining, and you're an employer. So let's say you're an employer in a particular industry. You could have a collective bargaining agreement apply to your staff, even though you're not involved in collective bargaining, you don't recognize a union, you have no staff who are union members, and really you have nothing to do with unions at all. I think the easier way to think of them in some countries...
I just have to say that's unbelievable from a U.S. perspective.
Yeah, the first time you come across it is a little bit shocking. But once you get used to the idea, what it really is, it's a kind of local way of agreeing laws. So the idea is you get different laws for different sort of groups of people. So you might have, let's say, a collective agreement for the chemical industry or for the tech industry or whatever it is. I'm ad-libbing a bit here, but you get the idea. And it might set things like mandatory restrictive covenants, mandatory notice periods, mandatory minimum wages, all sorts of things that you might expect to see in a normal contract or in legislation. And so that's just something to look out for. If you talk to a local advisor, they will always tell you whether there is a collective agreement or not. But that's why a lot of the documents are quite light in places like France, because the core terms are somewhere else. I'll just highlight a few other things which are a bit unusual. We've talked about contractors and employees. I think most of your audience are tax or HR background. They'll get that absolutely. There are differences between contractors and employees. Typically, the collective agreements apply to the employees. Now, commercial agents, I don't know if I even want to start this because you'll probably have a heart attack. All across the EU, we have this directive called the Commercial Agents Directive. And basically, it automatically gives legal rights to self-employed salesmen. So if you've got someone who's selling product, being paid with commission, who's not employed, these laws could potentially apply. And they're different in every European country. So there's a Europe-wide directive, but every country's done a different thing with the directive. These regulations are just, the only way I can say it is they are awful. They're very unclear. They're very difficult to manage. They provide for things that you just wouldn't expect. I'll give you an example. When you end the agency arrangement, you can have to pay quite a substantial termination payment because the idea that the agent's built up goodwill for the company. And they're quite complicated to document properly, so it costs you quite a lot of money to get the agreement drawn up as well. Generally, you mentioned rules of thumb. My rule of thumb on commercial agents is don't do it. If you think you might employ a self-employed salesman who is paid on commission, then take very careful advice and ideally get yourself in a situation where the regulations don't apply because you'll find life much easier. And don't be scared of employing people.
Can you give an example of how you could structure so the arrangement would not apply?
Well, the simplest way to structure it so it doesn't apply is to employ people instead, because the agency regulations don't apply to employees. So you could employ someone and pay them with commissions, and life would oftentimes be much simpler. And I think one of the cautions I would give there is often people see all this sort of European stuff as terribly complicated and difficult. It isn't as complicated and difficult on the inside as it seems from the outside. And in my experience, it is much easier sometimes to employ people than to engage them as self-employed contractors. There are all sorts of advantages to doing that. Yes, you have the tax withholding obligation. Yes, they'll have some employment rights. But on the whole, it's more manageable than dealing with a contractor. It's quite hard to do the pros and cons on a talk show because I will be boring, which was the thing you cautioned against. But it is something to look at. And just don't underestimate the costs of getting it wrong. It's something you have to look at if you're engaging people in Europe.
It's interesting because just from a U.S. perspective, I think it reverses the presumption. So typically a business person looks at employee versus contractor and says, well, contractor's a whole lot easier because it'll be less regulated. I can kind of do what I want, et cetera. But what you're describing is that because of this kind of superstructure around commissioned sales agents or commercial agents, that it's actually simpler and less expensive to employ versus contractor. It's the opposite of what we might assume.
That's often the case. That's often the case. So I think the thing to do is ask, because if you get someone who does it all the time, they can just tell you what they think is easier, and it's usually just easier to go with the recommendation. And the nuance will be different in different places as well. I just want to mention termination, because this is another one that's going to make you have a heart attack. In some countries, you can't fire people. I mean, I think for people who haven't come across that before, it's quite a difficult concept, and it certainly was the first time I came across it. In some countries, you need a good reason to dismiss someone, and that's something you need to be aware of before you hire people. So, it's I suppose, a good lawyer thing. Whenever you get into a new situation, you need to think about how much it's going to cost you to get out if things go wrong. And one of the questions you must ask if you hire people is what it will cost you to fire them and whether you're going to be able to fire them. The good news is when you're just hiring one salesman is most times it's not too bad. As the sales force or employment team grows, it can become more of an issue. But just be aware that in some countries, if you fire people, they are not fired. In the UK, we're we have protection against dismissal, but if you dismiss someone, they're dismissed. It's really a question of money. And some countries, if you dismiss them and you dismiss them wrong, the dismissal is void, and they are still employed, and they are still due their salary, and that can go on until the whole thing is sorted out, and it can be very, very expensive. So just
work in a practical way. I mean, you say, Mike, you're fired, and I say, well, actually, no, I'm not, because you needed judicial approval to terminate me, and so I show up to the office.
Well, in practice, let's suppose you do just that. Well, you'll lock the door and you'll take the security pass away, so they won't show up at the office. But let's suppose they're then back at home and they carry on, and there's a court case that doesn't sort of come up until a year's time. You may find that when the court case has sort of passed, the whole thing has passed through the courts, that you're ordered to pay back wages and to take them back. And you've got to remember, at the end of the day, the courts do trump, because at the end of the day, if you get a court order and you don't comply, in most countries, you end up in jail. So, there is a point where you have to comply. And I think the only thing I'm not trying to put people off employing, because this isn't going to come up every time. What I'm trying to do is encourage people to ask, because if you're aware that there's a potential termination problem, you might choose to hire someone somewhere else. And if they're, you really want someone because this is a valuable opportunity, you might weigh up how valuable that opportunity is when you know what the potential cost is if it doesn't work out. So I guess we're just saying, ask.
So just kind of briefly summarizing what I'm hearing from a U.S. perspective, that first of all, almost like a prenuptial agreement, you want to know what are the ways that terminations are restricted, both the process of how do I actually effect a termination? Do I need court approval or not? Can I actually say you're fired or not? And second, what the costs would be, both notice costs and also for commercial agents possibly costs for the increased goodwill of the business. As a footnote to that, I've found that it's helpful to take a snapshot of the business when you have the contract start, so at least you have the data about how many sales you actually had and what the volume of business was when the person started, so that you have some proof to go back on if you do have to negotiate or pay out a goodwill payment. And then in the context of that, you need to kind of cast your assumptions from a U.S. perspective aside, both with respect to at-will employment and also whether it's better to have a contractor or an employee. And then the final thing is be really focused on what industry you're in, because there may be minimum standards that are non-statutory through the mandatory collective agreements that that nonetheless would apply, and you're in a kind of unequal bargaining position if the local hire is aware of what those minimum standards are and you're not. Does that sound about right?
Yep, that's it. And don't be too put off. Usually the key to getting it right is to talk to someone local, and they'll tell you. I think people are quite straightforward about telling you what's difficult and what's easy.
So speaking of difficult versus easy, you split out the Middle East and Africa as being kind of different in certain ways from Europe generally. How is it different?
Lots and lots of ways. It always makes me laugh that the E and the EMEA are put together, because they only really have the time zone in common. I guess some things are the same. You'd expect contracts for people in these countries as well, and you've got immigration issues and you've got tax issues. Some of the things are a bit different. Some Middle Eastern countries, there's very little or no income tax. There's some pluses. These are a few of the things that sometimes catch people out. The first is there can be restrictions on who can employ. That's not the case in any EU country, but it's quite common, not just in the Middle East and Africa, but in the developing world, that there may be restrictions on who can employ. So it may have to be a local employer. You may have to set up a sub or something locally. And the restrictions can be quite surprising. Sometimes you have to post a financial bond. Sometimes there is a registration requirement that takes time. Sometimes you might have to have premises. So they want to know you're a real employer before they'll let you hire people. So that's worth checking out. I usually check that at the same time as I check immigration. The two things usually go together, and it's usually the same advisors that will advise. There are sometimes compulsory terms, a bit like the mandatory collective agreements, but just be aware in some places you can have a compulsory contract, so not just mandatory terms, but a whole contract. In some countries, the way people deal with that is they have two contracts, so they'll use the mandatory contract and then they'll have additional contractual terms which deal with the more complicated things that the business might want in addition, so for example, covenants, but you need a local advice on how that works. Third thing which often comes up is currency. I was going to say not really an issue in the EU, but obviously we have our own euro challenges at the moment. But once you start talking about Africa and the Middle East, you're talking about very different currencies from the currencies people are used to at home. And you are also far more likely to be hiring an expat, so somebody who's come maybe from the US or Europe, or maybe an expat who's already out there, but somebody who's expecting to be paid in another currency or to pay bills in another currency. So I'll give an example. I'm English, I'm sent to South Africa, but I have a mortgage back in England to pay. Well, South African currency is not that exciting for me. I might need some to spend locally, but I also need some back home. And of course, as soon as you start talking about currency, this is something that salesmen understand absolutely. You talk about hedging, are there exchange restrictions? How do you pin down the exchange rates in people's contracts? How do you deal with big currency movements? That sort of thing. So it's a challenge, but it's a challenge that people deal with. And in some African countries in particular, there can be issues with taking money out of the country. So just be aware of that. The next line is, again, it wouldn't be surprised, there are sensitivities about sexuality, politics, religion, that sort of thing. In my experience, people tend to be far more worried about things than, the reality really demands. But you do need to check these things out. And simple things, not just that you may have an extremist that you want to send to the Middle East. You may have somebody who expects to go to church on Sunday and not work on a Sunday, and instead they're going to be not working on a Friday. So they're just things that need to be discussed. And in my experience, the sort of shyness that HR people have about discussing these things is misplaced. It doesn't help anybody. I'll give you an example. Some Middle Eastern countries, you may have a compulsory HIV test before you can enter the country. It is much better that staff know about that before they go. And it is possible to tell everybody so that, the information isn't personal. But, just not addressing things is not helpful. It may also be difficult to sell if you're from a particular background. Transport safety and corruption, these are very jurisdiction dependent. But, obviously you need to think about where people are going to live, how they're going to get to work, how they're going to do their day-to-day business, because corruption is a big issue overseas. And, some businesses may think twice about selling in a jurisdiction which, if there is a problem, could have implications far beyond, the local environment. Most European and American businesses have very strong views on corruption. And it may just mean that some jurisdictions, are not for you.
So the question of jurisdictions, and which ones are for you, leads really to the next topic, which is where to go. If you're, like we said in the beginning, often the decision is really driven by a specific individual or business opportunity that is, really compels a certain location. But if that's not the case, if it's more longer-term planning towards expansion, how do you what kind of factors do you take into account?
Yeah, well, I think the first one is one, which is obvious to everybody, which is it is business driven. Where you're going to sell is not something your employment lawyer can help with. So, that's for the business. I would caution against the sort of modern drive or business drive, which is that I have a really valuable person and that person is going to, let's say, Holland because their partner is going to Holland and we want to keep them and they can work remotely. So what we call the virtual assignee. So just be careful that it's business driven and not people driven. because paying for the one-off person to live in the place they want can be a very expensive business decision. There are pros and cons to being in different jurisdictions. Some countries have reputations for being more difficult than others. Most people would choose to locate in the UAE in preference to Saudi Arabia, without analysing the detail. And similarly, within Europe, different countries have reputations of being easy or hard. Language may be a big driver. But I think the thing I would encourage people to do is really cost it out. I think a lot of these decisions are made first and then the costing done afterwards, and it gets very hard to unravel things once the process is started. And it really isn't doing anybody any favours to send somebody to a new jurisdiction, pump a lot of money into it, have them make a big effort and then pull out later. It's better to take time and really cost it out properly. And the hidden costs, some of them we've mentioned, Social Security, termination costs, some locations.
You're telling me about that really surprised me, like extra months of pay or extra pay on holidays and things that just are so foreign to a U.S. employer. What are those kinds of things?
Well, there are some surprises which come. They come out when you see it all the time. You get used to identifying the potential problems and asking the questions. It's really hard when you go into a new place for the first time, because what happens is you ask the questions, the advisor answers your question. All lawyers are a little bit channel like that. We answer the questions that were asked, and we don't always say yes, but it's not a problem because, or this is how people normally do it. And the 13th month payment is a classic example. Some countries, they don't pay people, in 12 equal monthly installments. Sometimes they pay them people in 13. So if you agree an annual salary, you may be agreeing to more money than you think you're agreeing to. And of course, it all causes bad feeling later if you then have to sort of move backwards from your original decision. Another example might be an expat who's sent abroad. It's very common for people to have expectations about what they're going to get because their friend had it or they had it in a previous company. And in fact, practices vary enormously between jurisdictions, between businesses, frankly, between different times in the world economy. And packages are a lot leaner now than when I first started advising. But if, for example, the individual has an expectation they're going to get housing and private school fees, that's going to be a much more expensive package than someone who's expecting just cash. So I feel like the cheap way to deal with that is to talk about it. The more you talk, the less you'll be surprised. I would encourage...
You're using a word that I just used recently. I was helping a client do some analysis in a jurisdiction, and the last question I asked each of the people I was meeting with was, what about doing business here locally surprises Americans when they first arrive? And that question led to the most interesting answers and interestingly common. They all basically answered the same thing, but something that never would have come. I would never have thought to ask the question.
Yeah, well, I think cultural awareness, talking off legal, cultural awareness training is very valuable for people who are moving into new jurisdictions. Just a simple thing like whether something's agreed could be different in different places. And approaches to dealing with problems. Some places, what you see is what you get. Sometimes Americans are shocked because English people use very long contracts. But actually, there's a sort of expectation setting process then. With the typical person here, if it's all written out in the contract, they won't argue with it afterwards. So it's actually worth doing. But the mindset is different in different places. And I think unless you talk to local people, business people as well as advisors, you don't really get a feel for what's normal and what really is to worry about. Holidays, people are always shocked by European holidays. We think they're perfectly normal, of course. But one of the surprising questions I used to get when I first started, people would say to me, why are we having sickness leave as well as holiday? And of course, to a European, the two are totally different things. We wouldn't dream of using holiday when we're sick. It's just different places have a different mindset.
So looking at that, we kind of had a summary slide on risk management generally. Can you run through what these issues are and why you think they're important?
Yeah, I guess what the big ticket thing is just to anticipate problems, to take the time to find out what the potential problems might be. We've highlighted termination, and it's two kinds of termination. What might happen if we need to fire people, but also what might happen if the sole person who's interacting with your customers decides to leave. That's really important. And another surprising thing about Europe, in some European places you have to pay for non-competes. You go on paying salary. Well, someone under a non-compete. And there are lots of practical things you can do to make life easier. Corruption I highlight just because the business damage can be so massively out of proportion to the one salesman. So I think that's something that's always going to be a concern. I guess just to the insurance currency hedging, I'm really just saying there are strategies for dealing with some problems. Not everything can be insured against, but there are things that people have done before that make life a little bit easier. One of the simplest things you can do to make life a little bit easier is not to leave one man on the ground, but to have more than one, because you tend to get far more trouble when you've got one person doing things on their own. I used to, when I first started doing inward investment work, I used to put a note in my diary for 2 years after we did the first contract, because almost, like a clock, that's when the first problems would start arising. After they got rid of the sort of excitement selling phase and people started being hired, that was when the problems would happen, because the salesman is not necessarily the best manager.
That is possibly a universal concept, that once the honeymoon's over, things start to get real and you need to follow up. Any other kind of final notes with our last minute here?
Not really, other than you need to manage your advisors. I think that is really important, because if you take advice on every last thing, the costs will be totally disproportionate. And I think you need to focus hard on the things which are really going to get you into trouble if they go wrong, and the things that really matter. So my top tips would be start with tax and start with immigration. I think they're the things that make the biggest difference.
Fantastic. So for those who've logged on and want to make sure they get their credit, we have pre-applied for HRCI credit and also continuing legal education credit in a variety of different jurisdictions. You'll be getting a survey form back from Michelle Hubbell, who will be sending out a sign-in sheet from Dorsey and Whitney, and with that you'll get a certificate of attendance from Michelle. That is, your key to unlocking both the CLE or HRCI credit. If you have any questions about that, just give her an email. Finally, if you still have questions on these issues, of course, the reason we do these programs is to stay connected with great clients and friends like those I see who have logged in, and also to be able to provide service. So please don't hesitate to contact either myself or Juliet. Our contact information is there on the screen and obviously on the web as well. We'd love to have your questions, your comment, and to assist in any way that we can. And then finally, I just wanted to highlight the next program. We'll be having another interactive dialogue. I've been told by Juliet to avoid the word quickie, which has connotations in the UK, but it has similar connotations here. So in any event, we're going to be talking about quickie union elections and preventive strategies. These are the new rules by the National Labor Relations Board that have been issued that allow, in some cases, union elections to occur within a 15-day time period. So please join us for that. Again, encourage you to fill out your evaluation forms. We really welcome the feedback, like it, and want to hear from you. So thank you all. Thank you, Juliet. And that ends our program.
Thank you. Please stand by.